It's Game Boy Works, and this is HAL Wrestling. I guess it was inevitable that in the course of covering these old game system libraries, we'd eventually get to a wrestling game. The trouble here is not that I dislike pro wrestling, but rather that I measure my disinterest in and aversion for the sport normally reserved for measuring stellar bodies. I can suffer through most sports games and know enough about the real event to have a decent sense of that adaptation's quality. Heck, I can even enjoy games about sports if they're well made, Nintendo's Golf, for example. When it comes to wrestling, though, I'd rather have the insides of my eyelids sandpapered with a sheet of 40 grit. So what you're about to experience is definitely not the best indication of whether or not HAL Wrestling is any good. Please hunt down alternate opinions if this seems interesting to you. Although, to be honest, I can't really seem to find an online consensus over the quality of this game. It seems to have inspired some genuine enthusiasm in certain corners of the internet, with superlatives like excellent and almighty being tossed around in reference to HAL Wrestling. On the other hand, it also appears to have elicited quite a few dismissive waves of the hand. So while I can say I got zero mileage out of this game myself, your mileage will inevitably vary according to whatever mysterious factors determine the quality of a wrestling game in your heart. So, HAL Wrestling. Despite the title, this is not a game developed by HAL. Satoru Iwata's company merely published it. Instead, it was developed for HAL by the legendary Human Entertainment. While that company flickered from existence way back at the turn of the millennium, with its talent drifting to the wind and its properties carved up and parceled out like a Thanksgiving turkey, during Human's brief time on Earth, they produced some of the most revered wrestling games ever made. For that, we can most likely thank the late Masato Masuda, a young game design savant with a particular fondness for pro wrestling. I have to assume my utter lack of enthusiasm for the sport simply reflects the fact that Masuda's love for wrestling was so intense it acted like a black hole, draining away the fanaticism that should have been mine by birthright. And in fact, Masuda made his debut with a game called Pro Wrestling, as in the NES Black Box game. We'll get to that one in due time on NES Works. But it's worth mentioning here because HAL Wrestling was actually called Pro Wrestling in Japan, whereas the NES game was called Pro Wrestling Famicom Wrestling Association over there. Pro Wrestling for NES was directed by Masuda under the auspices of a company called Tri, which changed its name a short while later to Human Entertainment. Curiously, Masuda doesn't appear to have had any involvement with HAL Wrestling if the game's credits are to be believed, but considering he was the wrestling savant at the company responsible for the creation of its biggest franchise, Fire Prowrestling, and this plays an awful lot like his other work, certainly he looms large over the production. So yeah, Masuda's greatest legacy is the Fire Prowrestling series, which debuted on PC Engine in 1989 and generally stands as a sort of platonic ideal for how wrestling video games should work. Currently, the property belongs to Spike Chunsoft, who have announced a new entry in the franchise after a very lengthy slumber. HAL Wrestling plays a bit like Fire Pro, with an emphasis on grappling, a remarkable variety of moves available, and generally a more realistic approach to wrestling than competing games, which tend to work more like fighters or brawlers. Fire Pro games are not pretty, especially the new one, but what the games lack in visual appeal they make up for with depth and substance. Still, HAL Wrestling does not belong to the Fire Pro franchise. Perhaps because it was commissioned by HAL, whereas Fire Pro is one of Human's rare and precious self-owned properties. Or maybe it's not called Fire Pro because Masuda didn't have any involvement with its development. Rather, its lead designer was one Yuichi Kobayashi, whose other credits appear to be a melange of Human and Konami titles, including Bastille, Clock Tower, and The Adventures of BAYOU Billy. However, he had also worked on the original Fire Prowrestling, not as a creative lead, but it seems likely that his involvement in that breakout title would have played a part in his landing the lead role for this offshoot in the Portable Ghetto. You can definitely see some sort of family connection here. Even a wrestling idiot like me can recognize the commonality between HAL Wrestling and Fire Pro. Like Fire Pro, HAL Wrestling emphasizes grappling, holds, and pins over your typical fighting game moves like punches and kicks. Certainly you can pull off simple blows or even do a running attack from the ropes, but ultimately to win a match here you need to enter the clutch, or whatever they call it in wrestling. The game also resembles a scaled-down take on Fire Pro in some other ways. It has a simple one-on-one career mode in which your wrestler of choice can take on a succession of competitors, but it also has a 3-on-3 exhibition mode, a trimmed counterpart to Fire Pro's 5-on-5 skirmishes. Oh, and while there's no build-a-wrestler function, it does feature a decent cast of original characters. Unlike most wrestling games of this era, it doesn't go the like a real sports personage but tweak just enough to avoid the need to pay image rights route. For a Game Boy release of its vintage, HAL Wrestling strikes me as being a remarkably solid adaptation of the sport. In fact, it's probably the most refined adaptation of any sport we've seen so far in Game Boy outside of golf, which shouldn't be surprising given the involvement of both HAL and human. I can't really speak to HAL Wrestling's quality as a wrestling sim, but we'll be seeing many more wrestling games throughout the course of Game Boy Works, and I'm 100% positive that most of them, if not all, will be much, much worse than this. So HAL Wrestling is good, even if it might have a bit of a low bar to clear. Next time on Game Boy Works, a missed opportunity to call a game Pocket Pool.